Welcome to Daily Musing, your sanctuary for thoughtful reflection and insightful conversations. My name is Benjamin-Whyss, your one and only host, and this week we're going to be talking about something very, very interesting, or something I feel like a lot of people decide to shy away from. So this week we're going to be talking about escape from trauma. So we're going to break down what trauma is, understand what different types of traumas are, what their lingering effects can actually be, and we're going to talk solutions. So this week, in our first episode, we're going to be talking about understanding childhood trauma and its lingering effect. Now, it is interesting to say that today, a lot of people are going through one trauma or the other, and it's either they do not know or they know and they actually choose to ignore it, and it often has a lot of underlying effect. In fact, sometimes a lot of people are shrouded in silence because they probably don't know how to deal with the trauma, or they think they can get help, or the trauma just turns them into something they don't even want to be. Right, so I'm going to define trauma extensively, starting from childhood trauma, so you can actually understand what it is. So childhood trauma, as defined by psychologists, refers to distressing experiences that a child endures that has a lasting impact on their mental, emotional, and even physical well-being. Right, so these experiences can vary widely. But the interesting thing is they share a common thread of pain and fear. Now, for example, we have abuse like physical, emotional, or even sexual abuse. We have people experiencing neglect, some people experiencing domestic violence, some people experiencing the sudden loss of a loved one, which is grieving, or living through a natural disaster, which is like the very, very height of some form of trauma. So what happens is that the innocence of childhood has been shattered, has been taken away by these harrowing experiences, leaving an indelible mark on the individual. Sometimes a traumatic experience could even be as simple as you having to grow up so early just to take care of your own siblings, or you had to grow up early because your parents needed you to be strong for the family at some point in your life, making you not enjoy childhood. That could also be a form of trauma. So it means that you got into teenagehood or you got into adulthood so fast that you never had a childhood, and it's telling a lot in your adulthood. It feels like your life is so fast-paced that you did not enjoy the beginning, the start phase of your life. So it means like you just grew into adulthood and you just started life without enjoying that beautiful, that innocent, childlike, experience. So what are the types of trauma we'll be talking about, especially childhood trauma, which is what we're starting with, right? We have physical abuse. I think 65 to 70% of a lot of people actually faced physical abuse, especially in Africa, right? This involves the use of physical force that requires injury or harm to the child. You see where parents actually beat a young child just because of something they did wrong. We've seen the different type of punishment style by parents or by adults on younger people, right? So it can range from eating them with anything, beating them, to more severe forms of physical aggression. And children grow up to actually think this is normal. It is why eventually you see people going into relationships where they are being beaten for wrongdoing, and they think it is okay because they grew up being beaten for wrongdoing. So when someone does that to them, even in adulthood, they think it is right because it is something they're used to since childhood. We have emotional abuse. Now, the subtle thing about emotional abuse is it is the most insidious of them all. It can be less visible, but equally damaging. A lot of children go through verbal abuse, go through a lot of humiliation, manipulation, and consistent criticism. A lot of children did not feel that emotional love that they would have loved to expect from their parents or from their loved ones or from people, adults generally, who grew up with them. So they grew up with this abuse into adulthood thinking that is actually the normal way to live. So it poses a problem to them because they have become emotionally stunted in their growth, that it becomes very hard to actually foster a good relationship with people. This is why a lot of people get into relationships and their relationships don't work. You see a lot of people dealing with different neglect. You see a lot of people dealing with a lot of low self-esteem, low self-confidence, and you're wondering, where is this coming from? The reason is because a lot of them have internalized the emotional abuse. So this trauma has affected them so much that it has damaged a substantial part of their emotional development that is hard for them to actually connect with actual human beings. We also have sexual abuse. This is a sexual activity with a child, whether through coercion, manipulation, or by force, which could be termed as rape. These are actually sexual abuse, right? So the betrayal and the violation experienced by this child causes a very profound psychological consequence, because we've seen scenarios where children grow up to either go into prostitution or they cannot even enjoy sexual relations when they grow up, just because they cannot forget the abuse they had as a child. And this in turn is going to affect your relationship with other people. We also have traumas like neglect. As simple as people look at that, this is an occurrence that happens when a child is starved of the basic needs, such as maybe food, shelter, medical care, emotional nurturing. When these things are not met, it stunts their development and brings emotional issues. It is the reason we talk about this issue every time. We talk about people having daddy issues, mommy issues. It's neglect. See people having abandonment issues. It's because they didn't grow up with a father figure or a mother figure, and that singular absence of that person in their life will go on to create a big issue for them. Right? It is why you see a lot of people, maybe when they grow up, they become maybe too clingy. They look for a father in everybody they date, or they look for a mother in anybody they're in a relationship with, or they just look for that loving in someone just because they've been starved of those things. We also have trauma like witnessing violence. A lot of children witness violence in their childhood, whether it's domestic, whether it's at home or in the community or in your school or probably areas where they find themselves, right? They might have experienced this trauma directly or indirectly, and this acquired form of learning violence actually sticks with them. We've seen scenarios where a child grows up seeing the father beat the mom, and this is not what he wanted, and eventually he beats his own girlfriend or beats the people he's in a relationship with. That is because this is something he saw a lot growing up. Even if it was something he hated, it is still something it became because it was not dealt with. So it is grounded inside his subconscious that even when he doesn't want to do it, he finds himself actually doing it. Right? And finally, the type of trauma we're talking about again is loss and grief. This is the sudden loss of a loved one, especially maybe a caregiver, maybe a parent, a loved one, which creates a very huge void. and a sense of insecurity and fear that a child carries forward into adulthood. It's where you see people who can stay long in a relationship just because they are scared that people will actually leave them, because probably when they were younger, a caregiver or a loved one or their parents actually died, leaving them to cater for themselves. So now we're going to talk about something very, very peculiar. So I want to talk about how trauma, whether childhood or any form of trauma, can actually affect the brain development. So because the brain of a child is plastic, so the term is neuroplastic. So what that means is it is malleable. It can easily adapt. It is highly adaptable to whatever is happening between the ages of 0 to 5, right? So childhood trauma doesn't just affect emotions and behavior. It actually affects the brain development of a human being, right? So because the brain is incredibly neuroplastic, it has the ability to adapt greatly to anything that happens to it, making it very vulnerable. So trauma can actually alter the structure and function of your brain. It is why a lot of us will wonder that why would someone suffering so much in a relationship or going through something still stay in that relationship, even when it means that it might take their life. It is because the brain has developed into that thing so much that even when it is impacting their life negatively, they don't think there's anything they can actually do. All right? So, and the problem is, trauma actually impacts and affects the part of the brain that is responsible for emotional regulation, impulse control, and cognitive functions. For example, the amygdala, that's the part of the brain that is responsible for processing your emotions. So, what happens is there is an overreaction in that part of the brain when you face a form of trauma, which results in heightened anxiety and fear responses, which could eventually lead to low self-esteem and low self-confidence. We also have the part of the brain called the hippocampus, which is the one responsible for our memory formation. So when a child or someone who is very young keep getting exposed to different form of trauma, what that does is it makes it difficult for them to keep stuff in their memory and learn, because the traumatic event and experience has taken a major and a core space in that part of the brain, right? So it will look like all their life, that is all they know. The trauma is all they know. So even when they're trying to learn new things, it is going to be very difficult because the continuous exposure they have to the trauma has made them become that way. Then we have the third part of the brain during development, which is the prefrontal cortex. That's the one that regulates your decision making, the one that causes impulse control. So trauma will impair the development of that part, which will result in having self-control issues and executive functions. It is why you see young people who were sexually abused eventually go into prostitution, because that is what has happened to them all their life. And it is just easy for them to just go into that aspect, to just go in that direction, because that is all they know. You see, some of them, it becomes very difficult to stop some certain habits or stop some certain things. Why? It is because that part of your brain that regulates these things has been impaired and learned to do a certain function we have grown up to work with. So, what are these lingering effects in adulthood? So what happens, right? Because trauma doesn't end in childhood. The funny thing is, it might hide for a very long time and begin to cast shadows into adulthood, right? We've seen a lot of unresolved childhood trauma cause terrible effects on adult behavior and even create a lot of mental health in numerous ways. Now, for example, if you're someone, right, who has an unresolved childhood, you would probably suffer from serious anxiety and depression, and even post-traumatic stress disorder that is called PTSD, and a lot of other mental health issues such as low self-esteem and low confidence, right? You might even have behavioral issues like trauma can cause you to abuse drugs, self-harm yourself, have some form of eating disorder, and even some other maladaptive behaviors as coping mechanisms. We've seen people who think that the best way for them to actually keep people in a relationship is to offer them sex. That's a maladaptive behavior. We've seen people where just to keep people in their relationship, they just give too much of themselves, right? Another effect in adulthood could be relationship difficulties. A lot of people will have trust issues because their trust has been betrayed a lot of times over time, so they don't trust people. People that have maybe daddy issues or mommy issues will find it difficult to trust other people because of what they faced. So people will have a fear of intimacy. Probably somebody who have been abused sexually, emotionally, who have the fear of intimacy because they've been taken advantage of before. There's also difficulty in forming and maintaining relationships. Yes, they would definitely hide away from people because they don't want to put themselves in that space of vulnerability anymore because of what they've experienced in their childhood or as they grow up. Also, the issue of self-esteem and identity. So trauma can severely impact one's self-worth and identity, leading to making them feel inadequate in themselves, making them always feel this sense of shame, this evasive feeling of low self-esteem, not feeling good about themselves, not thinking they're good enough for anything, and all of that. So I'm going to give some real life scenarios. So I've changed the name of the clients. I've anonymized them to protect their identities. I'm just going to give like a brief background and story about what they went through as a child and how it was affecting them in their life as an adult, right? And of course, we'll sought the permissions of those people to actually talk about their stories, but of course, their names are being protected, right? So the first person her name is Sarah. She's currently in her 30s. So she grew up in a household where there was domestic violence. It was like a daily occurrence. The dad and the mom were always at loggerheads. There was always serious infighting, and she grew up in this household, and she complained that it was a lot to take as a child, but there was nowhere for them to go, and she lived through it. And now as an adult, she struggles a lot with anxiety, and she has difficulty trusting others, right? She is currently unmarried because it has had a lot of effect on her relationship. Like, it has created a lot of chaos in her relationship, and she finds herself going through the motions and through the circles in different relationships because she's worried and she's scared that the same thing that happened in a parent's relationship might happen to her, right? Although she's currently undergoing therapy, and yes, she's getting better by the day, but this has always been her fears, and this has always been what she has been dealing with. So you see that it is actually a thing. Like, people go through these things, and the interesting thing about this person is it was not until we trace things back to what happens in her childhood. She thought she personally had a problem, right? She thought she was the one who just had anxiety on her own, and she was not able to trust others. So she, we give it different names these days. We call ourselves maybe introverts, ambiverts, or extroverts, or all of those names, right? Just as an example, I'm just giving that as an example. I'm not saying all of those things are bad. So we try to label things so that it can be easy on us, but that's not a solution. So it was not until she came for therapy and we went deep down to her childhood, and she began to talk about how she felt as a child, how she would run away and go and hide and feel terrified and feel very scared when the fighting was going on and all of that. And this was the thing she was facing in her adulthood And it was not until she came to therapy and she opened up about that aspect of her life that she realized that this is something she had carried from her childhood even into her adulthood. So you see why it is actually very, very important that these things be kept in check. We also have John. John said as a child he experienced serious neglect, said he was often hungry, he lacked emotional support because of the divorce of his parents. So now he is in his 40s and is battling depression. He even has a history of substance abuse, and he finds it very challenging to hold down a job and maintain stable relationships. So all of this became a thing where he was affected by what he went through as a child, and he's still battling it and dealing with it even in his 40s. So you can see how dangerous these traumatic events are and how they can actually, cause some form of impediment in people's growth even when they become adults, right? So we're going to put a pin in the story there, and we're going to conclude today's episode. So as we recognize these things, because what we are doing this week is to help you recognize what this trauma is. Yes, we're going to address them, but the first thing is you need to understand that they are wounds and they are very deep, right? However, with good support and intervention, the healing will come, right? So in our next episode, what we're going to do is we're going to explain how people transfer and take up traumas that is not even theirs, adding another layer of complexity to what trauma is. All right. So thank you for joining me today on the first episode of Escape from Trauma. All right. Remember, healing is possible and you're not alone on this journey. So until next time, take care of yourself. I remain your wonderful host, Benjamin-Whyss. I'll see you in the next episode. Bye.